Good afternoon, everyone. Hope lunch went well. So this is our second showcase, similar to the one we did yesterday, where partners will share what they're working on in quick 5 minutes, and we'll hold questions till the end, and we'll have microphone runners for that. So today we'll start off with Sara J. Sanford from Seattle, and then go to Cheryl Knott from Baltimore, and then Elly Schoen from LA, and then we'll end with Jenna Losh from the data center in New Orleans. So thank you, presenters, and Sara J., welcome.
Thank you. My name is Sara Jaye. I'm here from Communities Count, which is kind of based in Public Health Seattle and King County. And I adapted these slides from a 30-minute presentation, so wish me luck. I'm going to be talking today about data biographies, which we view as a tool to provide transparency, hopefully to many more of our stakeholders more accessibly, and support data literacy and equity and how we make data accessible to communities in Seattle and King County. And I'll mention this later, but I want to really shout out We All Count, which is a data equity kind of consulting network that gave us this idea. So we pulled together data from many, many sources. This is just kind of the tip of the iceberg of the data that our unit in the health department uses. And it's kind of a mess. It's all different colors because the data comes to us in all different structures, and it comes to us from all different data owners. And the data sharing agreements that we have, which in turn dictate some of the ways in which we can analyze and share that data, also have their own sets of values and constraints built into them. And I'm guessing that this both wonderfully and sometimes headacheingly diverse processing of data is perhaps familiar to many of you. So we take in all this data that we get all these different ways from all these different owners, and we produce many different kinds of data products, many dashboards. Again, this is just a few. And you know, just as sometimes navigating all that data can feel intense to us, I worry that it looks about that confusing to some of our partners as well. So we get a lot of questions, many boiling down to where does this data come from? And I hypothesize that that question's kind of the tip of the iceberg, and very often, especially when we get this question from community members, what they really want to know is, can I trust this data to accurately represent my community? So of course, we always cite our sources, but saying something like source American Community Survey doesn't, you know, it might answer that tip of the iceberg question, but it doesn't answer the deeper question below. So in an attempt to do that a little better, we embarked on this project of creating data biographies. So we created a template that answers what we think are the most basic questions about any data source. There's 2 slides just of those questions. You can take a look, but I really want to emphasize that each of these data biographies is a maximum of 2 pages long and really geared towards a lay audience. So you can imagine with like 8 to 10 questions, the answers to each of these questions are very concise and straightforward. This is not like a detailed resource for documentation. It's meant to just, you know, anyone, a high school student, that at least has some interest in data could read these and understand about how the data is collected and analyzed that we are sharing. So teamwork, as they say, makes the dream work. We involve new staff to help draft, as well as subject matter experts internally and externally to review. This turned out to be actually a great way to onboard new members of our team and make connections that they might not otherwise have with us in Communities Count and with some of our subject matter experts. So our amazing work study student also helped us design the way that we present these on our website. You can check it out there on the QR code. We have now, I believe, 6 up online, and we have 4 to 5 more that we're planning to post by the end of the year. We experienced many, for me, unanticipated benefits. I actually learned about data sources that I'd been using for years through the process of writing and editing these biographies. As I mentioned, it was an opportunity to connect with colleagues who didn't necessarily work in your normal day-to-day work teams. That really helped as we were all transitioning to the remote environment. But what we don't know is, what about users? internally we had great benefits, but I would love to know more about who's using these data biographies and are they finding them helpful. We've shared them with our user group. As I said, we've got a few more in process, and I'm really hoping that we can get more feedback on what's helpful or what could be more helpful so that we can continue to adapt and keep them fresh and useful going forward. Lots of words on this slide that I'm not going to read, but I want to really emphasize that we see this as one piece of broader data equity work that our team does. And I heard from some folks in our breakout group sessions today that that equity word can be really a big political touch point. And I've also heard that the data biographies can be a way to provide data equity without necessarily using that language, because it can be seen as very politically neutral to simply provide detailed information that helps folks understand where the data comes from, both what its strengths are and what its limitations are. So thank you to the team that worked on these. As I mentioned, our amazing work study student, and We All Count for providing us the idea. They have some great resources if you're interested on their website. We're also happy to share our templates. If anybody's interested, please do reach out and get in touch with us. Thank you so much.
Pressure's on. Pressure's on, the spotlight's on. So I know we've got a ton of new people here. So hi, my name is Cheryl, if we haven't had a chance to connect. And I wanted to also clarify our acronym. So I'm with the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance, and we refer to ourselves as BNIA. So I'm the research manager for BNIA. We were founded over 20 years ago to be a one-stop shop for data and information for all of Baltimore's neighborhoods. So today I'll be highlighting and focusing in on one of our recent award-winning projects, highlighting the various ways that we've used visualizations to tell the story of change in Baltimore. So when the first cuts of 2020 census data came out last year, we were bummed to see that Baltimore decreased in population by 5.7%. But this was not a decrease that was uniform across the entire city, as we can see in this map. The loss is not uniform, and growth is also not uniform across the city. So to dig deeper into the neighborhood variation, we produced a series of research briefs to understand communities, focusing in on these 6 topic areas. So looking at demographics, housing diversity, housing occupancy and rehab, accessibility, social connectivity, and overall quality of life. So the research briefs and project materials are hosted on an ArcGIS online hub site. The briefs are Esri story maps and utilize a variety of embedded visualizations from ArcGIS, Tableau, and Plotly. The hub site also allows us to easily compile all this information for our dissemination. So I'll share some examples of the data visualizations. The graphics that we created tell a mix of spatial stories through maps, obviously, but also statistical info. Most of the graphics relate back to population change, and we use the same diverging color scheme to just maintain some consistency on these visualizations. So population change is the #1 key indicator of community health. There's implications for communities that are growing or shrinking, and so having maps with sliders to compare 2000 to 2010, 2010 to 2020, on the same scale allow for a really in-depth look at community trajectories. So beyond population, we looked at other indicators of community change and identified noteworthy relationships. So in bar charts, we highlighted negative correlations in red, positive correlations in blue, and with each bar height for these representing the correlation coefficient. So population change is closely related to commute times over 45 minutes, which in and of itself has a positive correlation to race, to unemployment, and also to internet connectivity. And for this chart, we're looking at statistical significance at the 0.01 level. Digging into some of the housing data, we also plotted population change and the percentage of properties that are vacant and abandoned. We were able to, by analyzing this data, identify a threshold, and we saw this value a decade ago when we were looking at the data, and it holds true. a decade later. With the exception of the downtown community, areas in Baltimore with a residential vacant and abandoned rate above 4% generally do not have population growth. It's critical that residential properties, if they become empty, get quickly rehabitated to prevent code violations and potential subsequent decay. So as areas in Baltimore depopulate, there are a lot of implications for residents. We're less likely to see major private investments and seemingly steadfast institutions such as schools close. And so neighborhood population loss isn't specific to just one age demographic. We're losing children in a lot of communities too. So now on our next slide, we've got population change plotted out with change in library card membership in Baltimore. We know that in communities that are decreasing in population, we have an uptick in library card membership because libraries play a really critical role in serving communities, connecting people to job opportunities, learning resources, and other critical things to ensure that people succeed. So one of our students created a Tableau dashboard to really explore all of these relationships across our indicators. And here we can see kind of what that looks like. Despite some doom and gloom, we have some positive things going on in Baltimore. Decreases in teen birth rate, and with the exception of one community, we've had increases in racial diversity. In addition to the Tableau dashboard, we created compilations of maps from all the research briefs. So again, you can have all this info in one place. And so the hub site, which I've linked to in other slides, allows us to just, again, cohesively manage all of these pieces that we've been putting together for the project. So this project itself would not have been possible without all of the amazing support and hard work of our staff, students that joined us from a variety of different institutions, and of course, our sponsors that I've linked here. So I'm going to stop here because it's a lot of information, but you know, I encourage folks to reach out to me if they have any questions. My contact info is on the app. Thank you.
Okay, big green button. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elly Schoen, and I am the Systems and Data Manager at the USC Price Center for Social Innovation. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about some data work that we did for the South LA Transit Empowerment Zone, which is one of the 22 federally designated promise zones. So a little bit about Slate Z. It's a collaboration of over 50 public, private, and community-based organizations dedicated to revitalizing South LA by investing in its residents. The area that Slate Z serves is home to over 200,000 residents, which is about 6% of the city's population, and it's also the neighborhood that USC is in. So during the first half of the 20th century, this neighborhood experienced redlining. It was one of the only areas that Black residents could buy a house in, and it didn't receive a lot of investment over the years. Today, 86% of residents in the area identify as Black or Latino, and this area has also been the center of many historic, cultural, and social movements over the years. In the second half of the 20th century, LAPD became radically militarized and over-policed this community, and key manufacturing plants also closed that led to really high rates of unemployment. So as a result of those structural barriers to wealth creation, today, 75% of residents in this neighborhood are considered low income. Over the last decade, there has been huge investments in public transit infrastructure, including a new rail line that actually just opened a few weeks ago, the Crenshaw Rail. At the same time, typical home values in this region have increased by over 150% over the last decade. So this is a familiar narrative to many of you and something that we talked a lot about yesterday. In communities of color that have been structurally disinvested in for a century or more, an influx of development or investment in transit or business is still a racist policy if longtime residents haven't also been invested in and can't afford to stay there or take advantage of any of the new amenities. And so with all of that knowledge in mind, In 2016, in anticipation of the K-line opening up, a coalition of organizations came together to try to strategically capitalize on the investment, and Slate Z was formed. And Slate Z utilizes a collective impact framework, which is a type of social innovation where a group of important actors from different sectors come together around a common agenda to solve a specific problem. A couple of key tenets of a collective impact framework are a common agenda, a set of shared measurements, mutually reinforcing activities, a ton of meetings, and a backbone organization that oversees and coordinates everything. So last year, the backbone organization of Slate Z came to us and asked for help with their shared measurements. They had a lot of measurements that they couldn't get current data for. They had a lot of metrics that weren't actually measuring what they were doing. They weren't using data as much as they wanted because they didn't have a centralized place to look at it all. And they were also having a difficult time communicating their impact to South LA residents. So what we proposed is to bring our data expertise to help them kind of revamp their metrics, and also to build a public-facing dashboard that we would regularly update that would be a one-stop shop for Slate Z partners for planning the work, and also for community members to understand the difference that Slate Z was making. So I'm just going to share a couple of lessons from that work. And one is only measuring what you can directly impact. So one of the goals of Slate Z is to increase the safety of public and active transportation. And one of the old measures that they were using for that was violent crimes on public transit. And while that seems like a really good fit, and it's definitely something that we all care about, they didn't actually have any programs or activities that were addressing crime on public transit. However, they did just lead a coalition that invested millions of dollars in bike lanes in the community. And so a better measure of transportation safety for Slate Z is how many cars are hitting cyclists, because that is something that their programs and activities are directly impacting. A second lesson is around building tools for multiple audiences. So at the top of our site, we have a ton of summary and narrative for community members. For example, about how collisions with cyclists have decreased and why it's really, really important to have bike lanes and put up with all of that construction. At the same time, we also have a lot of really detailed tools for planning. So for example, we built a density map that shows the exact location of a bunch of collisions around their area mapped on top of bike lanes so that they can see where lots of collisions are still happening and where bike lanes are really, really needed. So those are a couple of our lessons. Please stay tuned. We're launching phase 1 of the dashboard in January 2023 with about 2/3 of our data. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. And I want to give a shout out to my wonderful boss, Caroline Bala, for making the work so fun.
All right. Hey, so I'm Jenna from New Orleans. Today I'm going to be talking about uncertainty and error, starting with how we at the data center deal with it, and then I take some inspiration from the NNIP Google group and some of the really great discussion that has happened around this topic with all of you guys, and that's like 11 years of email threads. So error shows up everywhere in the data that we use the most, and yet it's something that we ignore frequently out of like convenience or just necessity. But when we or our users dismiss uncertainty, it can lead to overconfidence in our results and false conclusions about how the world works or even how change happens. So I'm going to talk about some of the ways that we address error. First, how the data center presents data and its error to our users. And second, a specific method that we used for reducing error for a recent project, and then just a few alternative perspectives that have gotten me thinking about communicating error. And just like a little warning, it kind of gets into data geek territory here. So on our website, when we show users data in tables, they see the raw measures and the margins of error next to them. And there's a link out here from the margin of error that gives a pop-up with text describing how to think about and use margins of error, suggesting ways to frame them in grant reports. And there's also the statistical testing widget that allows users to pick their own data points to run stat tests on. And when there's reference data, we do like to report the results of stat tests. as a way to communicate error. And here's 2 examples of that. We published these charts with notation that points to footnotes where the results of stat tests are reported. And one of the big drawbacks here is, for the sake of brevity, we'll often sacrifice one direction of stat testing for another, for example, testing between years, but not testing between geographies. When there isn't reference data, in the past we've used these I-bars to show a possible range of true values within the confidence interval. And we've also done self-suppression of data points using the coefficient of variation as a reliability threshold. So this measures the reliability of a data point by comparing the margin of error to the data point itself. And the higher the coefficient of variation is, the less reliable the measure is. So we recently did a project that involved mapping a collection of data points for every census tract in Louisiana. And when we dug into the data, we found that the reliability issue was huge. 105 out of over 1,000 tracks were actually usable given our threshold. So we used a smoothing approach to address this error. So here's that same data at the Orleans Parish tract level. So it's poverty rate on the left that's raw, and then on the right is data that has been smoothed by averaging each census tract's data point with those of its neighbors. And we can see that the smoothing has compressed the poverty rate. So it certainly masks some disparity, but it does preserve the basic pattern. And the big benefit to this method is that the data presented in the smooth map is much more reliable. The raw data's tract level coefficients of variation are on the left map, and then the smooth data's CVs are on the right. And the orange colored tracks did not meet our reliability threshold, so we wouldn't have been comfortable reporting those. So you can just see the huge improvement in the amount of usable data. So here's an example of what the final product ended up looking like. It's on an interactive website that we published, and we display the smooth rates, and we also indicate which census tracts still don't meet our threshold of reliability using a striking pattern. And this analysis was carried out with a function that I wrote in R, so if anybody wants to talk code later, I would love to do that. So here's some suggestions, maybe with a broader application from the latest Google group thread that we had on this topic. A lot of people like these line charts with error shading for over time, which I think is super visually intuitive. And somebody also suggested the B-swarm chart as a way to get at variation within data, which a lot of people on my team were super into. So I decided to do an experiment. So this is a bar chart showing the median household income by race and ethnicity in Orleans Parish using ACS 1-year data, which has the advantage of being more timely. And for something like this, we would stat test the races against each other and report those results. Here's that same data point, household income, but at the census tract level for all of the census tracts in Orleans Parish. So it gives this nice sense of the variability, and that can maybe help communicate how unlikely it is that any one of these particular medians actually applies to an individual person. So here's a fun one. This is from an old scoop. Somebody suggested that in some situations, maybe it would be useful to use a set margin of error with a variable confidence rather than how we usually do it with a set 90% confidence with a variable margin of error, which, as we know, often creates these huge and difficult to comprehend ranges of possible true values. So all in all, thinking through all these things, it started reminding me of the Swiss cheese model of pandemic prevention, if y'all remember that, where it's not one specific intervention or way of thinking or talking about this that helps us understand it and communicate it effectively. It's everything together. And the more energy that we put into these kinds of conversations, the better case we build for collecting more data.
Thank you, presenters. There we go. So now we're going to move into questions, and we'll move some mics around if anyone has questions for our presenters. I'll let you take
that. Hey, where's Elly? It's a question. There you go. This was a question for you. As you're designing those measures, what was the relationship between you and then the Slate Z people on, that tension of metrics that they thought other people might want to hear and your grounding in what you can actually measure and impact, or some other tension?
Yeah, I would say generally our approach was that we worked a lot with the Slate Z Backbone organization, and they're also separated into working groups. And so we worked a lot with the co-chairs of each working group, who are community-based organization leaders. And they basically threw everything at the wall that they wanted. We did kind of listening sessions, and they just told us all their hopes and dreams. And then we kind of came back with what we felt like was the most practical thing that kind of checked all of the boxes in terms of what's available, what they're actually, what's measuring what they're actually doing, what can be updated regularly. So that's kind of the approach we took.
Question for Sara. So in the past, in other organizations I've worked for, we've tried to maintain data catalogs, but that becomes like a huge undertaking to constantly update that. So I'm wondering if with your data biographies, if you've got a mechanism in place to keep those as up to date as possible.
No, the mechanism is human review. But as I mentioned, these answer really basic questions about who collects the data, where, and why. So if there's like big significant methodological changes, we would definitely want to document that. But it is really not at the level of detail where I anticipate that they should be significantly changed on an annual basis. It really is kind of the bare bones of, I think, what a lot of lay folks want to understand about how, who's included in our data, who's not, where it comes from. And really I hope that it supports data literacy for folks who, may not be ready to like dig into much more technical documentation yet.
I'm here, sorry. James Neal again from IMLS. I believe it was Cheryl who talked about the pickup with library cards as related to community data. I want to give a shout out again to Bob Gradick and Liz from Pittsburgh, who worked with me I worked with them on the Civic Switchboard project. I wondered if Cheryl could talk more about the role of libraries in data ecosystems and how more public libraries can become involved with community data work. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like I could talk about that for a very, very, very long time. So maybe we can also connect after this session. Or yeah, a camp session, that could be a good idea. So yeah, we ended up putting together an entire chapter just looking at overall social connectedness, and the library card membership was one of the leading indicators that we were looking at there of figuring out ways that not only residents could be engaging with one another, but their access and use of resources. And so, thinking through, some of the recent data sets that we've been getting, so through the ACS having access to, the measure of percentage of households with internet at home, or the converse without internet at home, that became, a measure that we were thinking about of, okay, so if somebody doesn't have home internet access, how do they get connected to things? And that immediate answer is the library. And so we have worked pretty closely with the Enoch Pratt Library System in Baltimore to not only receive their data, but to also participate in processes to inform them of, potentially where they could open up new branches, where they could really have a great impact in the community to ensure that if people have needs, so if there's communities where unemployment rates might be high, digging into, there might be a lot of, reasons why we're seeing the data in some communities at certain levels, but thinking about, what are actions, what are solutions, who are stakeholders that can really be, harnessed, utilized, and trusted to help move the needle on some of the things that we're seeing. So, but yeah, I think we can continue this conversation and, take up a lot of great time talking about it, so.
Hi, I'm Alyssa from MAPC in Boston. Thank you so much for talking about margins of error. I feel like this is something at MAPC that we grapple with all the time and haven't really figured out how to address it in like a consistent way. And I think one of the takeaways of your presentation was that it's much more complex than having sort of a standard rule of thumb, but something that we tend to use at MAPC is that if the margin of error is greater than a third of the estimate, then we sort of say that it's not really that meaningful and kind of discard it. And I was just wondering, does this feel accurate to you? Is that something that you use?
Oh,
or is
gosh,
it just like more complex than we can even talk about here?
Yeah, so I mean, conceptually, the coefficient of variation is that's the idea. So it's like, how big is the margin of error compared to the measure itself? The difference is that coefficient of variation is actually standard error, which is, what is it? It's margin of error over the z-score. So that's what creates this percentage. I could not tell you why. Maybe I learned that at some point, but like, I'm sure there's some meaningful difference why it needs to be standard error as that proportion. Or maybe there isn't, and we would just have a different threshold if that's the way that we did it. And if that's what works for y'all, you know, it's like, it's so specific to what data point and where it is. And it's like, if what y'all have found is a third makes sense for this neighborhood, it makes sense for this, and like, it has felt right. You know, it's like, it's also balancing a priority of like being really truthful and like reputable with like just telling people stuff that they can accept. I guess like, oh yeah, there's this huge margin of error on this, but that's not a big deal. So, okay, looking at the threshold recommendations for coefficient of variation, some places the recommendation for a cutoff is like 40%. And so it's really just up to what your brand is in some cases. Like, there's a lot of flexibility, yeah. And it's all about the caveats. You just gotta tell people what you're doing to their data.
Thank you all for another great showcase. We have a few announcements before the camp session.